Hello everyone, I'm the Enforcer, and welcome back to the breaking news. Please make sure to like, comment, and subscribe, and support us on Patreon, the link in the description below. Starting off with some of our first breaking news of the day, we have heard that apparently Russian forces in Bakhmut are trapped in their current positions. This is a fairly interesting development of news, as the Ukrainians have not swept around the flanks and have besieged the city of Bakhmut, but according to Ukraine, they say that Russian forces have been trapped. And this was a fairly interesting statement to make, especially considering the condition of the front lines currently. We can see that in the northern area, the Ukrainians have been making progress, but they haven't swept around to the back of Bakhmut, near the area of Pokrovsk. And we can also see a similar situation developing in the southern flank. While the Ukrainians are most likely going to take Lishkivka, and therefore the Russians will lose the southern flank in Bakhmut, they haven't swept around the flanks and ended up besieging the city. And so this statement required a little bit of digging to find out what the Ukrainians really meant by this. And this digging was found by looking back at a British Ministry of Defense statement from yesterday. And to take you all to that real quick, the British Ministry of Defense was talking about how units that had been seen all around the Russian Federation and had been in parts of different theaters of command had been moved out of their areas and into Ukraine and are currently fighting on the front lines. For example, the 58th Combined Arms Army, who is in the Zaporizhia Oblast and currently defending around the area of Piatsky-Katsky, they usually are in the Caucasus region. And also the 5th Combined Arms Army, which is usually defending the border in between Russia and China, have been moved 7,000 kilometers from their original positions and were currently fighting around the area of Velika Novoselka. Not only that, but VDV forces, which are supposed to be the shield against the NATO offensive from the Baltics into Russia, they are currently fighting in Bakhmut right now. And what is being seen out of this is that the Russians are lacking any kind of actual combat reserves. They have no reserves at this point. They have bled their country dry of available manpower, and they are currently fighting on these parts of the front line. And what the Ukrainians are saying, and this appears to also be present along the entirety of the front line, which we'll be getting to in a minute, is that if Russian forces try to move at this moment, whether it be to reposition, whether it be move off the line to reinforce itself and resupply, they can't do that anymore because there's nothing to take their place. If a Russian unit, for example the 72nd Brigade, was to disengage from the Ukrainian forces at Klishkivka and move back to the area of Zaitseva or Popasna to resupply and reinforce their unit before they're moved back to the front lines, that would leave a giant hole in the front line right here where there's just no Russian soldiers. And so they're trapped in that position. They can't move back. They can't move forward, obviously, because the Ukrainians will slaughter them, and they're slaughtering them right now. And so they're stuck there. And all they can really do is pray that they last long enough that the Ukrainians lose steam. That's all that's left for the Russian forces in Bakhmut. And the Ukrainians have these forces trapped. The Russians can't move these forces anywhere else either. Because if they try and move them into the southern front, once again, it leaves a massive hole in Bakhmut. And therefore, these forces are completely trapped. They cannot move off the line. They have to stay here. And there's nothing that's going to be changing that situation here in the near future. And speaking of that, in the Southern Front, we've also been hearing something fairly similar from the Institute of the Study of War. The Institute for the Study of the War said that the failure to conduct any rotations will likely result in a quicker rate of degradation for Russian formations defending against Ukrainian counteroffensives in the south. And they also stated that Russian forces likely lack combat-ready reserves. And this is once again adding to the same problem we're seeing in Bakhmut, but we're seeing that it's about to start affecting the southern front on a far larger scale. Like Bakhmut, the forces that the Russians have in the southern flank are also trapped in their positions as well. There are no reserves or reinforcements to replace them, and so they have to remain engaged on the front line with the Ukrainians without break. That's also fairly odd in military terms. Usually, armed forces try to rotate their units out on a pretty steady basis where there are several weeks of action on the front lines and then there's several weeks or a few weeks of R&R behind the lines. We're not going to be seeing that for the Russian forces anymore. And that's going to be leading to an increase of many things. An increase in casualties, an increase in fatigue, a decreasing in combat effectiveness. Russian units are going to end up degrading, like the ISW said, at a far faster rate, considering that there is no longer any kind of R&R or any kind of rotations that will exist for these units. They will be fought. They will continue to fight to the death or fight until complete exhaustion collapses the unit, one or the other. And so the Russians right now are caught in a pretty bad spot. If they do anything, they're screwed. If they try and move any forces off the line, the Ukrainians will be able to push through the opening. They can't move any of their forces off the line, so they have to keep them there. But while keeping them there, those forces are ending up degrading to the point that they will eventually collapse, and that opening in the front line will inevitably happen. And so right now, the Russians are caught in probably one of the worst frontline situations, and it appears that that frontline situation is getting no better for them, as the President of the United States today announced that cluster munitions would be provided. We got a specific name for one of these cluster munitions, the M864 artillery shell, which can be fired out of a 155mm howitzer. So this could be fired out of a Panzerhaubitze 2000, an M777, a Caesar SPG, anything that fires a 155mm shell. This thing can be fired out of. It is a artillery shell of a similar size to a an Excalibur round. I believe that's an M982 round. Very similar in size, very similar in scale, and it launches out a cluster of bomblets in every direction, and these bomblets explode in contact with the ground. Apparently, these will be announced officially today, and the Washington Post also put this out just about an hour ago. And hopefully this helps the Ukrainians to further deplete the frontline units. With these kinds of cluster munitions, the Ukrainians can possibly strike Russian trenches and take out far more Russian forces than they would have been able to in a normal situation with conventional artillery shells. And so we'll be waiting to see what kind of actual damage and what kind of effect those have in Ukraine, because it appears that they are now certainly going to be on the way. A Russian ambassador also had a very interesting comment to make about this as well. He stated that this is an act of desperation by the West. And we can see right here that he said that the United States' intention to provide cluster munitions to Ukraine is a quote-unquote move of desperation, as Kyiv's counteroffensive did not go according to plan. That's a very interesting statement to make, just to observe it in a qualitative way, because if I remember correctly, the entire offensive inside of Ukraine didn't go according to plan for the Russians, and that's why it's the 499th day of the war. But apparently, of course, that doesn't really matter much for the Russians, and the Russians just view that everything is going according to plan. And according to plan, it has, with nearly 210,000 Russian soldiers killed. There's no other way to say that this went perfectly to plan. Speaking of going perfectly to plan, the Wagner coup is still being talked about in the background, and it was a massive event, one in which we have not seen in Russia over 30 years, any kind of attempted coup being made. And apparently the Germans had a front seat to the entire thing, as they wiretapped the negotiations that were going on in between Prigozhin and Lukashenko. And we can see right here, according to Nexta, German intelligence wiretapped talks between Lukashenko and Prigozhin on the 24th of June, which was in the middle of the coup, according to the German newspaper ARD. In addition, German intelligence suspected that Prigozhin would stage a mutiny a week before the events in Rostov, but could not confirm this information. But it appears that the Germans, and most likely the entire Western world, had an incredibly good idea of when this coup was going to be happening, why it was happening, and also the talks that had been going on, the negotiations after the coup had begun. And it appears that a lot of that information is just not being presented to the public at the moment, but it is certainly out there. If the Germans got that information being a NATO country, they certainly disseminated that to others, and especially the United States. And so U.S. intelligence probably has a very clear idea and a very clear understanding of exactly what the negotiations involved, exactly what the deal was that the Russians agreed to with Prigozhin, and it's just that we haven't really been hearing a lot about it. That, of course, throws up a lot of questions for people as to what was said, what was agreed on. Who knows? Who really knows? And we probably won't know for days or weeks. And I don't want to tell y'all we know what they agreed on, because right now it still seems that there's a lot of weird hooky business going on about this whole thing. Right now we hear that Prigozhin has never even went into Belarus. He's still in Russia, somewhere in St. Petersburg right now. We also heard that Lukashenko made no agreement for the Wagner to come to Belarus, so that's also up in the air as well right now. And we still hear that there's a criminal investigation being held against Prigozhin, but we don't know where he is. So there's still a lot of gray area in the Prigozhin coup and the aftermath of that, because a lot of that information isn't coming forward quite easily or really at all right now, and we're still waiting on getting more information to try and cover that story and, put it out the best we can. But right now, there isn't really much, and it appears that the West is holding back some information so that way they can put it out at a later date, probably when it's better for the world to understand the information rather than right now, because it could be escalatory at the moment. But with that, that is the summary of all of the news we've had from start to finish over the past 24 hours on the summary. I thank you all so much once again for watching. Make sure to like, comment, and subscribe. It really does make us happy to know that folks enjoy our videos. When y'all subscribe, it lets us know that people really do like them, and we put these out 7 days a week. We also put out nightly live streams on the war in Ukraine, covering the past 24 hours of combat information as well, every single night, 6 days a week, except for Mondays. And you can always count on that stream to be live at 10 p.m. Eastern Time every single night. And so with that, thank you all once again for watching, and I will see you all in the next one.